If you fly into Phoenix, Arizona today and look down at the green farmland and the long, straight canals crossing the desert, you are looking at a modern city built on top of a far older one. Long before Phoenix existed, another people dug canals across this same valley by hand, without metal tools, without the wheel, and without a single animal to help them. They cut hundreds of miles of channels into the hard desert ground, some wide and deep enough to swallow a person, and through them they pulled the water of the Salt River out to their fields. They farmed this valley for more than 1,000 years. And then, around the year 1450, the great villages fell silent. The largest canals went dry, and the builders were gone from the valley. When settlers arrived in the 1800s, they found the ancient canals already there, and in many places simply cleaned them out and used them again. The Oodham people, who never left this desert, have a name for the ones who built the canals. They call them the Huhugam, those who have gone, so who moved a river across the desert by hand. And why did they walk away from the greatest irrigation works in ancient America? To follow that question honestly, we have to start with the canals themselves, with the channels in the ground and what it took to dig them. The desert of central Arizona is a hard place to farm. It is hot and dry, with only a few inches of rain in a year, and without irrigation the land will not support large settled communities. But two rivers cross it, the Salt and the Gila, carrying snowmelt down from the mountains, and the people we call the Hohokam learned to take that river water and spread it across the land. Beginning well over 1,000 years ago and expanding their works over many centuries, they built a canal system of astonishing scale. By careful estimates, the Salt River Valley alone held several hundred miles of major canals, with many hundreds more of smaller branching ditches feeding the fields, the most extensive network of irrigation canals dug anywhere in ancient North America. The main canals were serious pieces of engineering. Some ran for more than 20 miles from the river to the fields. Some were wide enough and deep enough that a person could stand in them and not see over the top. And all of it was dug with stone and wooden tools and carried away in baskets, one load of earth at a time, by people who had no metal shovels, no wheelbarrows, and no animals to pull a plow or a cart. What makes the canals a true feat of engineering is not just their length, but their precision. To move water across nearly flat desert by gravity alone, a canal has to descend at exactly the right gentle slope, dropping just enough over each mile to keep the water flowing, without either pooling and stagnating or running too fast and tearing out its own banks. Too steep, and the canal destroys itself. Too flat, and the water sits and goes nowhere. The Hohokam solved that problem across a whole valley, laying out canals that held the correct, almost imperceptible grade over many miles, feeding a branching network of smaller channels that spread the water to field after field. They built and rebuilt headgates where the canals met the river, points where floods could and did tear the system apart, and where it had to be repaired again and again. This was not a village ditch. It was a coordinated public work on the scale of a small state, sustained and expanded across centuries, and it turned a stretch of hard desert into one of the most productive farming regions in ancient North America, supporting a large population in substantial towns, and those towns were more than farms. Across the valley, the Hohokam built great earthen platform mounds, raised stages of packed earth that held important buildings, and they built ball courts, large oval hollows where a game played with a rubber ball was held, a game and a court style shared with the great civilizations of ancient Mexico far to the south. At a place on the Gila River, now called Casa Grande, they raised an enormous building of caliche mud, 4 stories tall, the Great House, whose walls still stand in the desert today. These were people connected by trade and ideas across enormous distances, importing seashells from the Gulf of California and copper bells and macaws from Mexico and marking the sky. The Great House at Casa Grande has openings in its upper walls that align with the sun and the moon at key moments of their cycles, a calendar built into a wall. Much of what we know about how these people actually lived comes from one deeply studied village on the Gila River, a place the O'odham name gave us as Snaketown. The archaeologist Emil Haury led major excavations there, first in the 1930s and again in the 1960s, and Snaketown turned out to be a large, long-lived town, occupied for well over 1,000 years, with houses, trash mounds, ball courts, and cremation burials, and it became the yardstick against which the whole Hohokam sequence is measured. It is worth holding on to that image. This was not a scattering of huts beside a ditch. It was a landscape of substantial towns, linked by canals and trade and a shared religion, spread across a desert that looks, to an untrained eye, as though it could never have held anything of the kind. So the physical facts are these. Hundreds of miles of hand-dug canals, great houses and platform mounds and ball courts, a large desert civilization that farmed the Salt and Gila valleys for over 1,000 years, and much of it still traceable in the ground today. Every part of that is checkable, and some of it is still standing. What is far harder to explain is what happened around the year 1450 when it all came apart. If you enjoy slow documentaries that take a lost landscape and carefully reconstruct what happened to it, consider subscribing. because it genuinely helps these longer videos reach the people who like them, because the end of the Hohokam world is one of the real unsolved problems of American archaeology, and it is also where the story is most often told badly. Sometime in the 1400s, over a span of a few generations, the Great Hohokam system unraveled. The largest villages were abandoned. The great houses were left empty. The huge canals, which had required constant coordinated labor to maintain, fell out of use and began to fill with silt. A civilization that had thrived in this valley for more than 1,000 years effectively dissolved as an organized society, and the dense population that the canals had supported was gone. The obvious question is why, and the honest answer is that we do not fully know, though there are real and serious explanations on the table. One is water in both its forms. The same rivers that fed the canals could also destroy them, and there is evidence of severe flooding in this period. Great floods that could have ripped out the head gates and cut the riverbed deeper, leaving the canal mouths high and dry and beyond repair. A single violent flood season could undo generations of patient work in a matter of days, and a river that cut its channel too deep might never again feed the old canals at all. At the same time, long droughts would have starved the system of the water it needed. A second problem is subtler and comes from irrigation itself. When you water desert fields year after year, the water leaves behind tiny amounts of salt as it evaporates. And over centuries, that salt can build up in the soil until the ground grows too salty to farm well. This slow poisoning of the fields, called salinization, may have quietly undercut the whole system. And beyond the water and the soil, there were surely human factors. The strains on any society that grows large and complex and depends on everyone cooperating to maintain a shared lifeline. Most likely, it was not any single blow, but a combination, floods and drought and salt and social strain together, that finally broke a system that had balanced on the edge of a harsh desert for a very long time. But here is where an honest documentary has to correct the story that usually gets told, because the word people reach for, vanished, is misleading, and it hides something important. The Hohokam did not vanish. They did not disappear from the earth or fly away or dissolve into mystery. Their great centralized system collapsed, and their big villages emptied, but the people did not cease to exist. They dispersed. They reorganized into smaller communities, spread out, and changed how they lived, moving away from the enormous canals and the crowded towns toward a more scattered and flexible desert life. And their descendants are still there. This is the single most important correction to make, and it is one that older accounts and a lot of low-quality content get badly wrong. In the 1800s and long after, spectacular ancient ruins in the Americas were routinely credited to anyone but native people, to lost white races or vanished super-civilizations, and the empty great houses of the Arizona desert were a favorite target for that kind of fantasy. It is wrong, and it erases the living people whose ancestors actually did the work, because the truth about who built the canals is not a mystery at all to the people who live in that desert today, and this is where the record and the oral tradition meet. The Oodham, the people of this land, include the Akimel Oodham, the river people, and the Tohono Oodham, the desert people, and they have lived in and around these valleys continuously. In the Oodham language, the ancestors who built the great houses and dug the canals and then went away are called the Huhugam, a word that means, in essence, those who have gone, those who are finished, the ancestors. And here is the detail that ties the whole thing together. The name archaeologists use for this whole civilization, Hohokam, is simply that O'odham word, taken into English. The scientific label for the canal builders is the O'odham name for their own ancestors. The O'odham did not just live near the ruins, they carried the memory of the people who made them, named them, and understood them as their own forebears. And they continued the same fundamental way of life, farming the desert floodplains with river water right into modern times. The Akimel Oodham were still running irrigation farms along the Gila River when American settlers arrived, using the same rivers in the same way their ancestors had. The obvious objection deserves a straight answer. Can we be certain the O'odham are the direct descendants of the Hohokam? The exact genealogy is debated by scholars, and the transition from the great Hohokam system to the later O'odham world involved real change, so no one should overstate a simple unbroken line. But the continuity of place, of language tied to the ruins, of farming practice, and of material culture is strong, and the mainstream view connects the O'odham to the Hohokam as their descendants. The people who name the builders the Huhugam have by far the best claim to be their children. And it would be a mistake and an insult to reach past living descendants for some vanished lost race to explain canals that native people plainly dug. The formal study of the ruins came later, and it carries names and dates worth knowing. In the 1880s, an expedition funded by a Boston philanthropist named Mary Hemenway and led by the archaeologist Frank Hamilton Cushing came to the Salt River Valley and excavated Hohokam villages and mapped the ancient canals, one of the first serious scientific investigations of the civilization. Somewhat later, the archaeologist Jesse Walter Fewkes carried out major excavation and stabilization work at the Great House of Casa Grande, helping to preserve that towering building of desert mud, which had already been set aside as one of the country's first federally protected archaeological sites. Through their work and the century of research that followed, the scale and sophistication of the Hohokam achievement came into focus, and so did the strength of the connection to the Oodham. None of the deepest questions here are fully closed. We cannot say with certainty exactly why the great system collapsed when it did, and we cannot trace every thread from the Hohokam to the Oodham with perfect confidence. What we can do is separate the solid ground from the open questions. Here is what nobody seriously disputes. The people called the Hohokam built hundreds of miles of hand-dug irrigation canals in the Salt and Gila valleys of Arizona, the largest ancient irrigation system in North America, and farmed the desert with it for more than 1,000 years. They built great houses, platform mounds, and ball courts, and traded across enormous distances. Around the year 1450, their great villages were abandoned and the largest canals fell out of use. The Hemenway Expedition under Frank Hamilton Cushing, and later work by Jesse Walter Fewkes, brought the civilization into scientific view. And the O'odham, who live there still, call the builders the Huhugam and carry them as ancestors. Those are the solid stones. Here is where the questions begin. We do not know exactly why the system collapsed, whether flood, drought, salt, social strain, or all of them together delivered the decisive blow. We do not know precisely how the Hohokam world transformed into the Oodham world across those hard generations. And we cannot fully picture the valley, as it was at its height, the canals running full, the great houses crowded, the fields green in the desert. Visit the valley today and the traces are everywhere once you know to look. The great house at Casa Grande still stands under a protective shelter in the desert south of Phoenix. A great Hohokam platform mound and the mouths of ancient canals are preserved right inside the city of Phoenix, at the place long called Pueblo Grande and now known again by its O'odham name, where you can stand on a 1,000-year-old mound with the modern skyline rising behind it and look down into a canal the Huhugam cut by hand. And the modern canals that keep Phoenix alive still run, in places, along the very lines the Huhugam laid out 1,000 years ago. The story does not end with the ancestors either. When settlers dammed and diverted the Gila River upstream in the late 1800s, they cut off the water the Akimel Oodham had farmed with for centuries. And the river people, who had fed themselves and even fed passing travelers from their fields, were plunged into what they remember as years of famine and hardship. It is a bitter turn in the story. A people who had farmed this desert with river water since the time of the Huhugam had that very water taken from them by newcomers, almost within living memory, and it was only partly restored to them by legal settlements in recent decades. The O'odham hold their own account of the ancestors as well, told through the creation stories of Aitoi, the elder brother who is said to have led the people and who lives, in the tradition, in the mountains above the desert. To the O'odham, the ruins are not a riddle left by strangers. They are the houses of the Huhugam, kin who came before, part of a history that runs straight through to the families living in the valley today. The river and the fight over it did not end with the Huhugam. History is rarely settled by a single ruin, and some civilizations that are called lost were never lost at all, only changed, their children still living on the same ground. It is assembled slowly, one mapped canal, one excavated great house, one honored ancestor at a time, and sometimes the most important correction is to notice that the people we were told had vanished are standing right in front of us. The Oodham canals sit in that space. The work's real, the collapse real, the descendants real, and still here. The canals were dug by hand, the great villages emptied, the Oodham never left. Thank you for walking the dry channels with me. If you would like more of these, the kind that give a so-called lost civilization back to the people it belongs to, consider subscribing, because that is exactly what the next one does. Until then, a question worth sitting with. When a people move a river across a desert by hand, farm it for 1,000 years, and then scatter, and their descendants go on living in the same valley and name the builders as their own, is that the story of a civilization that fell, or of one that simply learned to bend and survive?